In 1627, Spanish merchant Diego de Castillo's caravan vanished in the desert between the cities of Potosi and Arica, carrying a load of silver ingots and church relics worth a total of 8,000 pesos. 12 days later, a search party found half of the camels wandering among the dunes without their loads or riders, and 3 days later, the remains of the camp in the middle of perfectly smooth sands, where not a single trace of wind had been seen in recent weeks. The traces of people and animals ended 30 feet from the center of the camp, as if the caravanners had stepped into thin air. The searchers saw strange prints in the sand, wide, wavy grooves resembling the tracks of a giant snake slithering just below the surface of the dunes. The records of search party captain Antonio Ramirez, kept in the archives of the governorate of Lima, indicate that local nomads from the Atacama tribe refused to approach the site and spoke of an ancient predator dwelling in the depths of the sandy sea. They called it the Mother of the Dunes and claimed that the creature only came out to hunt on windless nights, when the surface of the desert became mirror smooth and travelers could not hear it approaching amid the howling wind. The relics were never found. The silver disappeared without a trace. Of the 42 people in the caravan, not a single one returned. Diego de Castillo was an experienced trader who knew the routes through the Atacama Desert like the back of his hand. For 15 years, he led caravans between the silver mines of Potosi and the port city of Arica on the Pacific coast, transporting precious metals and church property to be sent to the metropolis. His caravans were never attacked by bandits, for Diego paid generous tribute to both the Spanish patrols and the Indian chiefs who controlled certain sections of the route. His route had been tested by dozens of crossings. Water sources were marked on maps. Rest stops were chosen for their protection from the wind and proximity to wells. In early March 1627, Diego assembled an unusually large caravan. In addition to the usual silver from the mines, he was carrying valuable cargo for the cathedral in Lima. 3 gold reliquaries with the remains of saints, brought from Spain, a silver tabernacle made by Toledo craftsmen, and 12 large candlesticks made of pure silver. The total weight of the precious metals exceeded 2 tons. Diego hired 18 armed men from among the retired soldiers of the Viceroyalty to guard the cargo and purchased 25 llamas and 7 mules to transport it. He took 4 Quechua Indians as guides, who knew the secret water sources between the main wells. The caravan left Potosi on March 7th in clear weather. The first 3 days of the journey passed without incident. The caravanners traveled along a well-trodden road connecting the mining towns with the coast. In the evenings, they set up camp at known water sources, where they found traces of other caravans, fire pits, pack animal dung, and inscriptions on stones left by previous travelers. The temperature rose to 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, but experienced travelers moved mainly at dawn and before sunset, waiting out the midday heat in the shade of rocks or improvised canvas shelters. On the 4th day, the caravan turned off the main road, choosing a little-known route through the interior of the desert. Diego de Castillo made this decision after meeting a small trader who reported a gathering of bandits on the usual route. The alternative route was 2 days longer, but was considered safer. There were no settlements where bandits could hide, and the rare nomads from the Atacama tribe were neutral towards the Spaniards, preferring to avoid contact. The Indian guides knew this route only superficially, but claimed to remember the location of 3 wells, which would be sufficient for the journey. The desert in these places had a special character. Unlike the rocky plains on the main route, here began the sand dunes, tall, rolling hills of reddish-yellow sand stretching to the horizon in all directions. The wind shaped them into bizarre ridges and valleys, creating an ever-changing landscape. There was no vegetation. Even the thorny bushes and tough grass that were occasionally found in the rocky desert were completely absent here. The only landmarks were the distant mountain peaks to the west and the shape of the dunes themselves, which an experienced guide could read like a book. The caravan found the first well after a day's journey through the dunes. It was a shallow pit between 2 high sand hills, where the groundwater came close to the surface. The Indians dug 6 feet into the sand and found a wet layer from which water slowly seeped out. Cloudy, brackish, but drinkable after settling in leather wineskins. The animals were watered first, then all available containers were filled. The process took most of the day, as the water came slowly and they had to wait for the pit to refill after each scoop. While the caravan drivers were busy with the water, the guards noticed a strange detail. Around the well, at a distance of about 100 feet, the sand had an unusual structure. It was denser, compacted, as if something heavy had passed over it. But there were no traces as such. Only wide, barely noticeable depressions running in parallel lines and disappearing into the dunes. One of the soldiers, named Rodrigo Martin, who had previously served in a garrison on the coast, told his comrades that he had seen similar tracks on the beach after a storm, when the waves had washed large sea snakes ashore. But here, 100 miles from the ocean, several thousand feet above sea level, the presence of sea creatures seemed absurd. Diego de Castillo ordered the caravan not to linger at the well longer than necessary. The caravan moved on in the twilight, intending to travel several miles in the cool of the night before setting up camp. The moon was full, illuminating the dunes with a ghostly silver light. The sand crunched under the feet of men and animals, a clear, almost musical sound created by the friction of billions of quartz grains rubbing against each other. The air was still. Not the slightest breeze could be felt. The surface of the dunes was perfectly smooth, without the ripples that even weak air currents usually create. The Indian guides led the caravan through the valley between two particularly high dunes, choosing the path with the densest sand. From time to time, they stopped, listening to something, then changed direction by a few degrees. One of the Spanish soldiers asked the senior guide about the reason for these stops. The Indian replied that he was listening to the sand. Good sand is silent underfoot, while bad sand sings before disaster strikes. The soldiers laughed at the savage's superstition, but Diego de Castillo, who had spent half his life in the desert, ordered his men to remain silent and follow the guide's instructions without argument. Around midnight, the caravan stopped for the night in a shallow depression between the dunes. The location was chosen for its protection from possible wind, although the air remained completely still. 12 tents made of coarse canvas were set up in a circle. In the center of the circle, they piled up their valuable cargo. The animals were tied to wooden stakes driven into the sand. They lit 3 fires from the dry llama dung they had brought with them and the few roots they had gathered in recent days on the rocky stretches of the road. The flames burned steadily, without flickering, casting motionless shadows on the sand. Diego de Castillo set up a watch schedule, 6 men at a time, changing every 3 hours. The first shift took up positions around the perimeter of the camp, holding loaded muskets and arquebuses. The rest of the caravan settled down to sleep, wrapped in woolen blankets, for the nighttime temperature in the desert dropped to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a sharp contrast to the daytime heat. The animals stood quietly, only occasionally grunting or shifting from foot to foot. There were no sounds from outside, no howling jackals, no chirping nightbirds, no rustling lizards in the sand. The silence was complete and strange, pressing on the eardrums. An hour after the camp had fallen silent, one of the sentries, a soldier named Pedro Vasquez, noticed movement on the slope of the nearest dune. Something was moving just below the surface of the sand, creating a barely noticeable bulge that moved parallel to the camp at a distance of about 150 feet. The movement was slow and smooth, reminiscent of a large fish gliding underwater. Vasquez called out to the other sentries. 3 soldiers gathered together to observe the strange phenomenon. The bulge passed along the entire length of the camp, described a wide arc, and disappeared behind the opposite dune. The sentries woke Diego de Castillo and reported what they had seen. The merchant came out of his tent, taking with him a Dutch-made telescope. He examined the surrounding dunes at length in the moonlight, but saw nothing unusual. The sand lay smooth and motionless. There were no tracks visible except those left by the caravan itself. Diego ordered the guards to double their patrols and keep the fires burning until dawn. Then he ordered one of the Indian guides to examine the place where the soldiers had seen movement. The Indian, a thin elderly man named Aya, climbed barefoot up the slope of the dune and walked along the presumed route of movement. He stopped frequently, pressing his ear to the sand, then took a few steps and repeated the action. Returning to camp, he reported through an interpreter that the sand in that spot was warm, warmer than it should be after sunset. He also said that he felt a vibration, very faint like distant thunder underground. When Diego asked about the nature of the phenomenon, the Indian replied evasively, using a word in the Quechua language, which the interpreter translated as Mother of Sand or Mother of Dunes. No further specific explanations were forthcoming. The rest of the night passed without incident. The movement under the sand did not repeat itself. At dawn, the caravan got up and prepared for the day's journey. Diego de Castillo decided to speed up the journey, planning to reach the next well in one long journey instead of the usual 2. The animals were loaded quickly, and the camp was broken down in an hour. By 6 in the morning, the caravan was already moving west, following the guide's directions. The day was exceptionally hot, even by desert standards. By noon, the temperature had exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The air shimmered above the hot sand, creating mirages. Ghostly lakes of water on the horizon, inverted reflections of dunes, silhouettes of non-existent trees. People and animals suffered from thirst, despite regular sips from water skins. Their skin was covered with salt from sweat. Their lips cracked. Their eyes watered from the bright light reflected by millions of sand crystals. By midday, the first disaster struck. One of the mules carrying boxes of church candlesticks suddenly stopped, refusing to move on. The animal trembled, pressing its ears to its head, and let out a long, plaintive cry. The drivers tried to force the mule to walk, using whips and prodding, but the animal only resisted more strongly, backing up and nearly overturning the load. Then Diego ordered the load to be removed and redistributed among the other animals. When the boxes were removed from the saddle, the mule collapsed onto the sand and died a few minutes later without even trying to get up. An examination of the carcass revealed no apparent cause of death. No wounds, no bites, no signs of poisoning. The animal's heart had stopped suddenly, as if from a severe fright. One of the soldiers, who had experience working on horse farms, expressed the opinion that he had seen similar deaths in horses driven to complete exhaustion by predators, when their hearts failed from overwork and terror. But the mule had not been driven. It had been walking at a normal pace, showing no signs of fatigue until the very last moment. The carcass was left where it died, as there was no time or energy to bury it in the hard sand. 2 hours after the mule's death, the caravan noticed strange formations in the sand ahead. About a quarter of a mile away, the surface of the dune was dotted with numerous round depressions, each about 3 feet in diameter. The depressions were arranged chaotically, covering an area of several hundred square yards. Their edges were perfectly even, their walls steep, and their depth was 2 to 3 feet. Something white was visible at the bottom of some of the depressions. Diego de Castillo ordered the men to halt and sent 2 soldiers to investigate the strange formations. The men descended into the valley and approached the nearest hollow. What they found at the bottom caused one of them to cry out and recoil. They were bones, human bones, half exposed, not yet completely stripped of dried flesh. The soldiers examined several other hollows and found similar contents. Each contained the remains of 1 or more people, partially buried in the sand. In total, they counted 13 hollows with bones. When the soldiers returned and reported their findings, panic broke out among the caravanners. Some demanded to turn back immediately, while others insisted on moving forward quickly. Diego de Castillo struggled to restore order. He ordered the 2 most experienced soldiers to return to the depressions and examine the remains more carefully, trying to determine who the dead were and how long ago they had died. He himself took a telescope and climbed to the top of the nearest dune, scanning the surroundings for other signs of danger. The soldiers who had gone down to the bones found scraps of clothing, coarse cloth typical of the Indian tribes of the region. Some of the bones bore teeth marks, deep scratches and chips left by the jaws of a large predator, but the nature of the damage was strange. The teeth that left these marks were arranged in rows, like those of a shark or large reptile, rather than in pairs of fangs, like those of mammals. The victims' skulls had been crushed with terrifying force, as if they had been squeezed in a vice. The number of remains and the nature of the burial indicated that an entire group had perished here, possibly a band of nomads or a small caravan. From the top of the dune, Diego de Castillo saw something that made him turn pale. A mile to the west, right on the caravan's planned route, stretched an area of strange sand. Its surface was not smooth as everywhere else, but wavy, covered with concentric circles, as if a series of underground waves had passed over it. This area stretched for several miles in width and disappeared beyond the horizon. It seemed impossible to bypass it. That would mean deviating from the route for several days, and water supplies remained limited. According to the guides, the next well was located just beyond this area 10 miles away. The merchant went down to the caravan and gathered a council of war with the senior soldiers and Indian guides. Through an interpreter, he asked Aya what the wavy sand ahead meant. The old Indian was silent for a long time, then said that it was a sign of Mother Dune's movement, that she had recently hunted here and might be somewhere nearby beneath the surface. He strongly recommended turning back and choosing another route, even if it took an extra week. But Diego calculated their water supplies and realized that turning back was impossible. They had already passed the point of no return, and the remaining water would only be enough to move forward to the next well. After a brief discussion, they decided to keep going, but with the utmost caution. The caravan reorganized into a tighter column. Armed soldiers spread out around the perimeter, keeping their weapons ready. The guides were sent ahead, ordered to walk 100 feet in front of the main group and signal in case of danger. The animals were tied with short ropes to prevent them from panicking and running away in case of an attack. They moved slowly, carefully examining the sand ahead of them. They began crossing the area of undulating sand at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The surface beneath their feet was solid, but it felt unstable, as if they were walking on a frozen lake of dubious strength. With each step, the sand made a muffled crunch. Unlike the usual squeak, the air temperature remained extremely high, but the caravanners noticed a strange detail. The sand under their feet was warmer than it should have been, even in direct sunlight. It seemed as if the heat was coming from somewhere below, from the depths of the dune. Half an hour into the journey, the guides walking ahead suddenly stopped and waved their arms, signaling danger. The caravan stopped immediately. Diego de Castillo ran forward, trying to see the cause of the alarm. The Indians pointed to the sand 20 feet ahead of them. A strange pattern had appeared on the surface. Concentric circles began to spread out from a central point, as if someone had thrown an invisible stone into the water. The circles expanded slowly, reaching a diameter of 30 feet, then faded. But after a few seconds, the process repeated itself, starting from the same central point. Everyone froze, watching the phenomenon. The soldiers raised their muskets, pointing them at the strange disturbance. One of the caravan drivers picked up a stone and threw it into the center of the circles. The stone fell onto the sand, sank into it for a moment, then slowly began to sink, as if in water, and after a few seconds disappeared completely. The circles on the surface began to spread faster and stronger. The sand in the center began to rise, forming a bulge about 2 feet high and 15 feet in diameter. Diego de Castillo shouted the order to retreat. The caravan began to back away, maintaining its formation. The animals sensed the danger before the humans did. They bellowed and stamped, trying to break free from their tethering ropes. One of the camels broke its rope and ran back along the path the caravan had come. 3 more animals followed, throwing off their riders. The soldiers were unable to stop the panicked flight, and several men ran after the animals, seized with terror. The bulge in the sand grew faster. Now it was as tall as a man and continued to grow. The sand at the top of the bulge began to crumble, revealing something dark, wet, and covered with scales the size of an adult man's palm. The scales were a dirty gray color with a yellowish tinge, exactly the same shade as the surrounding sand. They moved, sliding, glistening in the sun with an oily sheen. A huge head emerged from the sand, flat, triangular, blind, without eyes, but with a pair of deep pits on the sides that may have served as sensory organs. The creature's mouth opened, revealing 3 rows of teeth, sharp, curved backward, designed not to tear flesh, but to hold its prey and pull it inside. A putrid smell wafted from its throat, the smell of digesting flesh and acid. The creature made a sound, a low, vibrating hum that was felt not so much by the ears as by the whole body, causing the insides to tremble and the heart to skip a beat. The sound spread through the sand, and the caravanners felt a vibration under their feet. Diego de Castillo, despite his horror, retained enough composure to give the order to fire. 8 muskets fired almost simultaneously. The bullets struck the creature's head and front, kicking up clouds of sand dust. Some ricocheted off the scales, leaving only white scratches. 2 or 3 pierced its defense, entering its flesh, and a thick yellow liquid, more like pus than blood, flowed from the wounds. The creature reacted instantly, its body lunging forward at incredible speed just below the surface of the sand. The front of the caravan scattered in panic. People ran in different directions, dropping their weapons, luggage, anything that could slow their escape. The creature caught up with the nearest person, one of the Indian guides, in a matter of seconds. The sand beneath the unfortunate man's feet suddenly collapsed, forming a funnel into which the man fell waist deep. He screamed, trying to get out, grabbing at the edges of the funnel, but the sand flowed through his fingers. The funnel widened, pulling its victim deeper. A moment later, the creature's head emerged from the center of the funnel, its mouth opened, closed on the Indian's torso, and both figures disappeared under the sand. The funnel collapsed, leaving only a perfectly smooth surface. Diego de Castillo shouted, trying to restore order, but his voice was lost in the chaos of screams and gunshots. Some of the soldiers continued to fire randomly into the sand, hoping to hit the creature beneath the surface. Others tried to round up the scattered animals. Still others simply ran, not caring where they were going. The merchant saw 4 people who had run after the fleeing animals suddenly stop half a mile from the main group. The ground beneath them began to ripple, forming 3 separate sinkholes. The men tried to escape by jumping from one sinkhole to another, but the sand pulled them in. One by one, they disappeared, and the sand became smooth again. By this point, it was clear that there was more than one creature in the sand. The caravan was under attack by at least 3, and possibly more, of these underground predators. They moved beneath the sand at incredible speeds, appearing in the most unexpected places. Their hunting method was effective and terrifying. They created local areas of liquefied sand, turning the solid surface into a deadly trap from which there was no escape. Their victims were pulled down, where toothy mouths awaited them. Diego gathered the remaining soldiers around him and gave the order to move to the nearest high dune. Logic suggested that creatures adapted to moving in sand might have limitations on how deep they could sink, and at the top of a high sand hill, the caravan would be relatively safe. A group of 20 people, including Diego himself, the 2 remaining guides, and 15 soldiers, began the ascent. They carried with them supplies of water and the most valuable part of the cargo, gold reliquaries and a silver tabernacle. The rest of the property, including most of the silver ingots, was abandoned. Climbing the dune, which was about 300 feet high, under conditions of extreme stress and physical exhaustion, was an agonizing ordeal. The sand crumbled underfoot, rolling back down, forcing them to take 3 steps for everyone forward. The men crawled on all 4s, grabbing the sand with their hands, sinking knee-deep. The heat was murderous. 2 soldiers lost consciousness halfway up and had to be dragged to the top. Behind the fugitives, ominous funnels continued to appear in the sand below, slowly approaching the foot of the dune. Reaching the top, the caravanners found a relatively flat space about 30 by 30 feet in size. Not enough for a full camp, but enough to gather together. From here, they could see the surrounding area. Endless dunes in all directions, devoid of any signs of life. Below, where the caravan had recently passed, the sand was dotted with dozens of craters of various sizes. The animals had disappeared. Either they had fled or been killed. Abandoned belongings were gradually being sucked into the sand, as if the desert was devouring everything that dared to disturb its peace. Diego de Castillo took roll call. Of the 42 people who had started the journey, only 21 remained. 7 had been killed in front of the survivors, while the rest had either fled and died separately or disappeared in the chaos of the first attack. A count of supplies showed that there was enough water for 2, maximum 3 days with strict rationing. There was enough food for a week. There were 8 muskets, 4 arquebuses, and several swords. Gunpowder and bullets, 50 rounds per barrel. Of the valuable cargo, they managed to save 3 gold reliquaries weighing a total of about 20 pounds and a silver tabernacle weighing 30 pounds. The rest of the silver, which made up most of the caravan's value, remained below. Night fell on the survivors at the top of the dune without tents, without fires, with a minimal supply of blankets. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The men huddled together, trying to keep each other warm with their body heat. 2 wounded men, injured during the climb or in the fight with the panicked animals, moaned in pain. One of the Indian guides, Aya, sat apart, staring intently at the dark sand below. When Diego approached him and asked what he saw, the old man replied that the creatures were still there below, that they had surrounded the dune and were waiting. Indeed, upon closer inspection, slow movement could be seen beneath the sand around the base of the dune. The moonlight reflected off the surface revealed faint wave-like disturbances, long ridges that moved in a circle, describing concentric orbits around the hill. The creatures patrolled the area, not approaching the steep slopes of the dune, but not leaving either. They were laying siege. At dawn, it became clear that the situation was critical. Descending the dune with predators below would be suicide. Staying at the top meant a slow death from thirst and hunger. Diego de Castillo gathered a council and proposed 2 courses of action. The first was to wait for the wind, a strong wind that would change the surface of the sand and possibly hinder the creature's movement. The second was to send a small group of volunteers on a breakout attempt to reach the next well and return with help. 3 soldiers volunteered to attempt the breakout. They were young men, unmarried, with no families in Potosi, seeking adventure and easy money. Their names were Rodrigo Martin, Juan Pacheco, and Diego Lopez, a strange coincidence of names with the leader of the caravan. The three were given half of the remaining water supplies, loaded weapons, a compass, and detailed instructions on the direction of travel. The plan was to descend the dune from the north side, where the slope was steepest and possibly difficult for underground predators to traverse, then run without stopping to the next well, which the guides estimated to be 8 to 10 miles to the west. The descent began at 7 in the morning, when the sun was already high enough to see the surroundings clearly. 3 soldiers descended quickly, almost sliding, using their muskets as support. The others remained at the top, watching, weapons at the ready, prepared to open fire if the creatures attempted to attack. The sand beneath the fugitives' feet began to move when they reached the middle of the slope. Ominous funnels began to form 50 feet away from them. The soldiers accelerated, reached the foot of the slope, and ran westward, leaping in long strides across the loose sand. The creatures reacted immediately. 3 parallel waves rose from beneath the sand and gave chase. The predators were faster than humans, but the soldiers had an advantage. They were running on the surface while the creatures had to fight their way through the thick sand. The distance between the pursuers and the pursued alternated between decreasing and increasing. From the top of the dune, the rest of the caravan opened fire, aiming at the waves beneath the sand. The shots were mostly ineffective at such a distance, but they distracted one of the creatures, causing it to turn back toward the dune. Rodrigo Martin, Juan Pacheco, and Diego Lopez ran until they disappeared behind the crest of the far dune. 2 disturbances in the sand still followed them, but the distance between them gradually increased. At the top of the dune, where the main force of the caravan remained, a tense silence of anticipation reigned. Some men prayed. Others continued to watch the sand below, where now only 2 creatures patrolled instead of 3. By noon, the temperature had risen again to unbearable levels. The people at the top of the dune were suffering from thirst, but water rationing was strict. 1 sip every 3 hours. 2 of the wounded fell into a delirious state, muttering incoherent phrases and trying to get up. They were held down by force, tied with straps to the remains of the luggage. One of the soldiers, Pedro Vasquez, who had noticed movement under the sand on the first night, began to show signs of insanity. He claimed to hear voices coming from the sand, that creatures were talking to each other in a language of vibrations, planning an attack. Others tried to calm him down, but he became increasingly agitated. By the evening of the second day, it became clear that the breakout had failed. The 3 soldiers who had left at dawn should have reached the well by midday and, in the best-case scenario, returned with help by evening or the next morning. But time passed, and there was no sign of help or the fugitives themselves on the horizon. The creatures at the foot of the dune continued to patrol, their numbers seemingly increased. Now 4 or even 5 separate disturbances could be discerned, describing wide circles around the hill. The night brought new challenges. The temperature dropped even lower than the previous night. One of the wounded died from a combination of injuries, dehydration, and hypothermia. His body was laid on the edge of the flat summit and covered with a blanket. There was nowhere to bury him and nothing to bury him with. The sand on the summit was too loose to dig a grave, and going down meant certain death. Pedro Vasquez went completely mad. He threw off his clothes despite the cold and began shouting into the darkness, calling out to the creatures, offering himself as a sacrifice if they would let the others go. Before anyone could stop him, he threw himself down the slope of the dune. The fall and slide down the steep slope took about a minute. Vasquez screamed all the way until he reached the bottom. There he tried to get up and run, but the sand beneath him was already moving. A funnel formed in 3 seconds, pulling the soldier in up to his chest. He continued to scream, waving his arms, until the creature's head appeared. The mouth closed, the scream stopped, and the sand became smooth again. It all happened so quickly that those remaining at the top did not even have time to react with gunfire. On the 3rd morning, 17 people were left alive on the dune. The water was gone. There was still food, but eating without water in extreme heat was painful. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their tongues were swollen. Their urine had turned dark and smelled strong. Some of the men began to delirium. Diego de Castillo understood that if help did not arrive today, tomorrow most of them would be unable to move, and the day after tomorrow, deaths from dehydration would begin. Around noon on the 3rd day, when hope was almost gone, one of the sentries shouted, pointing south. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. a telltale sign of a large group moving through the desert. The cloud was getting closer. An hour later, figures could be made out. It was a detachment of horsemen on mules, about 20 men, armed and organized. The detachment moved cautiously, avoiding areas of suspicious sand, but approached the dune where the remnants of the caravan had taken shelter. These were men from the Arica garrison, a military patrol under the command of Captain Antonio Ramirez, sent to search for Diego de Castillo's caravan, which had not arrived on schedule. The patrol had left Arica 10 days ago, following the main road in reverse. Then, on the advice of local nomads, turned onto a little-known path through the dunes, where, according to rumors, the merchant's caravan had last been seen. The patrol stumbled upon a scene of carnage, a field littered with abandoned belongings, animal bones, and several human remains, already partially buried in the sand. Captain Ramirez was an experienced officer who had served in the Viceroyalty of Peru for more than 15 years. He had seen a lot: Indian attacks, skirmishes with bandits, natural disasters. But what his men found in the desert did not fit any of the patterns he knew. The nature of the destruction, the strange craters in the sand, the complete absence of traces of human attackers. Everything pointed to something else. When the patrol spotted survivors at the top of the dune, Ramirez ordered them to approach with extreme caution. The rescue operation was organized competently and quickly. Ramirez sent 3 horsemen to the foot of the dune with supplies of water and ropes. The horsemen approached from different sides, distracting the creatures under the sand. As soon as the sinkholes began to move, the rest of the patrol opened heavy fire with their muskets, aiming at the centers of the disturbances. At the same time, ropes were lowered from the top of the dune, along which the exhausted caravanners began their evacuation. The operation took 20 minutes of intense work, accompanied by constant firing to keep the predators at bay. 17 people, including Diego de Castillo and his assistants, were rescued. They were in terrible condition: dehydrated, sunburned, traumatized, many in a state of psychological shock. One died 2 hours after being rescued before returning to civilization. The remaining 16 survived the journey to Arica, which took another 5 days via a safer, albeit longer, route through the rocky desert. Captain Ramirez questioned the survivors in detail, recording their statements in the official log. The descriptions of the monsters were so fantastic that many in Arica treated them with skepticism. Some claimed that the caravan had been attacked by a well-organized band of robbers using some kind of cunning traps in the sand, and that the stories of giant underground creatures were the product of imaginations driven mad by heat and thirst. Others believed that there had indeed been an attack by large predators, possibly an unknown species of desert snakes or lizards, whose size and abilities had been exaggerated in the panic. Diego de Castillo lost everything: a cargo worth 8,000 pesos, 40 pack animals, his personal savings invested in the expedition, and, worst of all, 26 human lives. The 3 soldiers who had broken away, Rodrigo Martin, Juan Pacheco, and Diego Lopez, were never found. Captain Ramirez's patrol discovered their tracks, which led west for about 4 miles, then ended at the edge of a particularly deep crater. There were no remains nearby. The merchant lived for another 7 years, but never recovered from the experience. He no longer led caravans, sold his shares in trading companies, and settled in a monastery in Lima, where he spent his days in prayer and repentance. Before his death in 1634, he dictated a detailed confession to a priest, in which he claimed that the creatures in the sand were God's punishment for the greed of the Spaniards who plundered the riches of the New World. The priest recorded his words, but the document was never published, remaining in the church archives. Captain Antonio Ramirez attempted to organize an expedition to study and possibly destroy the predators in the sand. He assembled a detachment of 50 well-armed soldiers, stocked up on gunpowder and lead, and hired Indian guides from the Atacama tribe. But the guides categorically refused to lead the expedition into that part of the desert, despite the proposed payment. They said that Mother Dune could not be killed, that she was older than the mountains, that she slept deep beneath the sand and awoke only when she was hungry or when someone disturbed the peace of her hunting grounds. Without guides, the expedition became impossible. Ramirez sent an official report to the governor of the Viceroyalty, describing the events and recommending that a certain area of the desert be declared off-limits to caravans. The governor reviewed the report but took no official action. Instead, information spread unofficially among the merchant guilds that certain routes through the desert were unsafe and should be avoided. The merchants took note, and over the following decades, the route taken by Diego de Castillo's caravan was completely abandoned. The Quechua and Atacama Indians had long known of the existence of predators in the sand. Their legends mentioned the Mother of Dunes, a giant snake-like creature, or perhaps several such creatures, living deep beneath the surface of the desert. According to tradition, these creatures appeared in ancient times, possibly even before humans arrived in the region. They live deep in the sandy seas, where the temperature remains constant, where there is no light or sound, where there is only eternal sliding through millions of tons of loose quartz. Legends describe their behavior and abilities with surprising accuracy, matching the observations of the caravan survivors. The creatures hunt by creating local areas of sand liquefaction using some unknown mechanism. Perhaps vibration, perhaps the secretion of special fluids, perhaps some other method unknown to science. They can sense movement on the surface from a distance of several hundred yards. Their sensory organs, located in their heads, detect the slightest vibrations of sand grains. They do not need sight. In the eternal darkness under the sand, eyes are useless. The nomads also knew that the creatures were most active at certain times. On windless nights, when the desert surface became perfectly smooth, and every step a traveler took created a clear signal that traveled long distances. During the day, when the wind constantly moves the sand and the surface temperature is extreme, the creatures stay deeper in cooler layers and hunt less frequently. There were also areas that the Indians carefully avoided. Places where the sand had a strange wavy pattern, where no vegetation grew, where no animal bones were found, because all living things instinctively shunned these places. In the centuries that followed, Spanish colonization of the region continued, but the inner sandy areas of the Atacama Desert remained largely unexplored. The main trade routes ran along the periphery, along mountain ranges or closer to the coast, where the likelihood of encountering underground predators was minimal. Occasionally, disappearances occurred. A small caravan, a group of prospectors, a military patrol. But in the harsh desert conditions, such losses were attributed to natural causes, and few people associated them with legendary monsters. Several documents mentioning the incident with Diego de Castillo's caravan have been preserved in the archives of the governorate of Lima and the monastery libraries of Arica and Potosi. These include Captain Ramirez's official report, Diego's own confession recorded by a priest, and several testimonies from surviving soldiers and guides. These documents were rarely studied because they seemed fantastic and unreliable. 19th century historians who reviewed the colonial archives classified them as examples of popular superstition and panic among uneducated caravanners. However, in the early 20th century, when geological studies of the Atacama Desert became more systematic, some scientists began to find strange fossils in ancient sand deposits. These were fragments of scales and bones of large reptiles or amphibians of unknown species, presumably living millions of years ago when the region's climate was different. The size of some of the finds indicated creatures up to 50 feet long and weighing several tons. Specialization for an underground lifestyle was evident. Reduced or absent eyes, elongated bodies, powerful muscles for moving through dense environments. The question of whether such creatures could have survived into historical times without being detected by the scientific community remains open. The Atacama Desert is one of the driest and least hospitable places on Earth. Its interior regions are still poorly explored. The deep layers of sand, tens of meters below the surface, where the temperature remains stable throughout the year and where humidity is created by underground waters, could theoretically support the life of specialized organisms. The lack of confirmed observations can be explained by the rarity of encounters, the secrecy of the creatures, and the fact that victims do not survive to tell a credible story. Local Indian tribes continue to avoid certain areas of the desert. When modern researchers or tourists ask about the reasons, the elders give evasive answers, referring to the sacredness of the places or the lack of water. But occasionally, in confidential conversations, old legends about the Mother of the Dunes resurface, suggesting that she is still there, deep beneath the sand, patiently waiting for unwary travelers. Some old men claim to have seen strange tracks after windless nights, long, wavy furrows running across the dunes and disappearing at dawn as if they had never been there. There are also modern reports, albeit unverified, of strange disappearances in remote areas of the desert. In the 1970s, a group of geologists from a Chilean university went on an expedition to the interior of the Atacama to study mineral deposits. Only 3 of the 6 people returned. The official version is that they got lost and died of dehydration. But one of the survivors, before dying in the hospital from the effects of heat stroke, raved about movement under the sand, about funnels pulling people in. His words were attributed to the hallucinations of a dying brain. In the 1980s, a small tourist caravan and jeeps attempted to cross a particularly deserted area in search of adventure. 2 of the 4 jeeps got stuck in the sand under strange circumstances. The ground under their wheels suddenly became loose, almost liquid, and the cars sank to their axles. Attempts to pull them out with ropes caused the jeeps to sink even deeper and eventually disappear completely beneath the surface. The tourists fled on foot, leaving behind their vehicles and most of their equipment. A rescue team that arrived 2 days later found no traces of the vehicles. The sand at the site where they had sunk was perfectly smooth. The Atacama Desert keeps its secrets. It is quite possible that under millions of tons of sand, in darkness and silence, there is an ecosystem completely isolated from the surface world. Creatures that have adapted to life in this environment over millions of years of evolution may be so specialized that it is virtually impossible to detect and study them using traditional methods. They do not need sunlight, do not depend on vegetation, and feed on animals that occasionally stray above ground and careless humans. Their life cycle may be measured in decades or centuries. Their population may be extremely small, scattered over a vast territory. The story of Diego de Castillo's caravan remains a little-known episode of the colonial era. It did not make it into history textbooks and did not become the subject of scientific research. Documents describing these events gathered dust in archives, accessible only to a few specialists studying the details of everyday life in the Spanish colonies. For most historians, it is just another example of the dangers of trade routes through the desert, one tragedy among many others of that time. But for those familiar with the complete records, who have read the detailed accounts of the survivors, who have seen the strange fossils from the deep layers of sand, this story takes on a different meaning. It becomes a reminder that the world still holds secrets, that there are places where nature remains untamed and deadly, that some boundaries are better left uncrossed. The Atacama Desert stretches for hundreds of miles, lifeless and beautiful in its harshness. The dunes rise and fall under the influence of rare winds. The sun scorches the surface during the day, and the cold grips it at night. And somewhere deep below, in the eternal darkness between the grains of sand, ancient predators may still be lurking, patient and relentless, waiting for their next prey. Travelers crossing the desert on modern roads in cars and buses look at the endless dunes and see an empty, dead space. They do not know the stories that these sands could tell. They do not hear the warnings whispered by the elders of the Indian tribes. They do not see the strange tracks that disappear at dawn. And perhaps that is for the best. Some knowledge is useless. Some secrets are better left undisclosed. Some places are not meant for humans. The desert remembers. The sand holds stories written in bone and blood. And Mother Dune, if she truly exists, continues her eternal drift in the depths, indifferent to the world above, awakening only when hunger becomes unbearable or when someone's careless footsteps disturb the silence of her domain. The story ended for Diego de Castillo and his men in the year 1627. But for the desert, it was just a brief episode, a moment in geological time. The dunes remained. The creatures remained, if the legends are to be believed. And the danger remained, hidden beneath the deceptively calm surface of the sand, waiting for the next travelers brave or foolish enough to enter its hunting grounds. Some boundaries are not meant to be crossed. Some places demand respect, not conquest. And the Atacama Desert, ancient and deadly, remains one such place. A reminder that even in the 21st century, even with modern technology, nature retains the ability to be mysterious and unpredictably dangerous.